So it's very easy to discuss at length what's so great about the classical world and why classical study is important. The classical world of Greece and Rome has a great legacy. It has great prodigious output that anyone can draw from. So what was great about the classical world? However, what are some of the criticisms of ancient Greece and ancient Rome, and ancient Rome in particular? One can look very recently at the works by Terry Jones. Terry Jones has a very entertaining book and very entertaining documentary series called Barbarians. And these are widely available online on YouTube and Google. Terry Jones Barbarians. He's got episodes on the Persians, on the Sassanids. He's got episodes on the Vandals. He's got episodes on the Goths, episodes on the Celts. All of these groups that the Romans called barbarians. And what is a barbarian? What do you think of when you hear the word barbarian? You think of a poorly dressed savage, a savage with a helmet and dressed in furs and so on. And these, when we think of the Romans, we think of the polite, refined, civilized Romans dressed in togas, spreading civilization, spreading marble villas and so on. Yet Terry Jones challenges that. So when you review Terry Jones's documentary, you can see how he challenges that when he shows that the barbarians, their civilization was not so barbaric. They weren't necessarily bloodthirsty. In fact, he looks at lessons of conquest. When the Romans conquered the barbarian tribes, they were a lot more bloodthirsty than the Vandals or the Celts or Gauls or the Goths. For example, when Caesar conquers Gaul, hundreds of thousands of Gauls are killed, for example. And when the Gauls sacked Rome hundreds of years earlier, there wasn't great destruction or loss of life to the Romans. The Romans were certainly embarrassed and certainly became paranoid about the Gauls. But the sack of Rome by the Gauls was hardly as vicious as the conquest of Gaul by the Romans. These are the criticisms. These are the different perspectives that Terry Jones raises in his documentary series, Barbarian. So it's well worth watching. Were the Vandals really Vandals? Vandals, the tribe, did they vandalize Rome when they sacked Rome in the 400s? And Terry Jones says, no, not quite. In fact, the Vandals wanted to emulate Roman civilization, not destroy it. And he draws a lot of contrast between the Vandals, the Huns, and the Romans, which was more civilized. For example, we can see we know how the Romans treated women. Not very well. Women were not full citizens under the doctrine of paterfamilias, where the males would rule. We know that Rome was a slave society, so we put those words in that order very purposefully. The society could not function without slaves. It was a slave society. And so how do we know that? We can look at the story of Spartacus, for example. The story of Spartacus, the slave and gladiator. Is there anything more bloodthirsty than gladiatorial combat, than men being forced to die in gladiatorial combat? And so what's so great about the classical world? What's so significant about the classical world? Well, we've seen the great literature, the political lessons, the philosophy of the classical world, but others like Terry Jones offer a different perspective that challenges our outlook on the classical world. And so we can see as the Romans conquer that they're rapacious and avaricious. They want gold. Caesar conquers Gaul for the gold. Terry Jones points that out as he looks at the amazing Celts in his documentary series. So whereas Petrarch wrote that all history is praise of Rome, we need to ask, is that true? Is that true? Is all history praise of Rome, or should we criticize the classical world? Or are we being too hard on the classical world? Does it really matter how moral the Romans were? The Romans had moral failings. The Romans were paranoid about their enemies. They were paranoid about Mithridates. They were paranoid about Spartacus, as we can see when reading Tom Holland's Rubicon. But the Roman institutions and Roman civilization can tell us a lot of lessons. Even their failures can tell us a lot of lessons. We can look at our political leaders. We can look at our wars, and we can draw a comparison with Roman wars, and we can draw lessons too. As the Romans made moral failings, it's important for us to study the classics so we can learn from those moral failings. As the Romans engaged in wars, we should study the classics so we can learn from those wars as well. So all in all, in reviewing these materials, we can answer the question, why is the classical world significant? What's so great about the classical world?